By the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era, the Roman Republic stood as the undisputed master of the Mediterranean world. It had defeated Carthage in the Punic Wars, crushed the Hellenistic kingdoms of Greece and Asia, and expanded its territories further than any Roman of the early Republic could have imagined. The triumphs brought immense wealth to Rome, but they also brought deep and dangerous divisions. Land and riches flowed into the hands of the elite, while small farmers who had once formed the sturdy backbone of the Roman army found themselves impoverished, displaced, or forced into the swelling slums of Rome. The Republic's political institutions, built for a city-state, strained under the pressures of ruling a vast empire. The consequences would soon prove catastrophic. The first cracks appeared in 133 BCE with the reforms of Tiberius Gracchus, a young tribune of the plebs, alarmed by the growing gulf between rich and poor, and by the decline of citizen farmers who traditionally served in the legions. Tiberius proposed redistributing public land that had been monopolized by the aristocracy. The idea was simple, but revolutionary. For generations, wealthy families had treated public land as their private estates, and they saw Tiberius's proposals as an attack on their power. In a shocking display of violence, a group of senators and their supporters clubbed him to death on the Capitoline Hill, along with hundreds of his followers. It was the first time blood had been spilled in the political heart of Rome, and it set a terrible precedent. 10 years later, his brother Gaius Gracchus tried again, expanding the program to include subsidized grain and even suggesting citizenship for Rome's Italian allies. His vision was bold, but opposition was fierce. The Senate once more resorted to violence, and Gaius, facing armed mobs, took his own life. The Republic had crossed a line. Politics would now often be decided not by debate or law, but by bloodshed in the streets. In the decades that followed, the Roman state lurched from one crisis to another, and ambitious generals increasingly turned their legions into instruments of personal power. Chief among these was Gaius Marius, skilled commander who rose to prominence by defeating the Numidian king, Jugurtha, and later by saving Italy from invading Germanic tribes. Marius revolutionized the Roman military by allowing the landless poor to enlist, giving them a career in the army and promising land in return for loyalty. This reform gave Rome stronger armies, but with one fatal flaw: the soldiers. Devotion now belonged to their generals rather than to the Republic itself. Marius's career set the stage for his bitter rival, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. When Sulla was denied command in a war against the Eastern king Mithridates, he marched his troops on Rome itself in 88 BCE, the first general in Roman history to do so. Civil war erupted, and though Marius briefly regained power, Sulla eventually triumphed. Declaring himself dictator, he ruled with terror, drawing up lists of enemies marked for death, seizing property, and reshaping the constitution to strengthen the Senate. Though he eventually retired, the damage was done. Generals had learned that legions could decide the fate of Rome, and blood could replace ballots. Meanwhile, Rome faced discontent at home and rebellion abroad. The social war between 91 and 88 BCE erupted when Rome's Italian allies demanded the citizenship that had long been denied to them. Though the Romans crushed the revolt militarily, they conceded politically, granting citizenship to most Italians. The Republic survived, but it had grown larger, more unwieldy, and harder to govern. In the following decades, the ambitions of men like Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar would push the Republic further toward collapse. Pompey the Great rose as Rome's most celebrated general, sweeping pirates from the seas and expanding Roman dominion into Syria and Judea. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, gained fame by brutally putting down the slave rebellion led by Spartacus. And then came Julius Caesar, a man of dazzling ambition, eloquence, and cunning. In 60 BCE, these three men bound themselves in an informal alliance known as the First Triumvirate, dividing power among them while undermining the authority of the Senate. Caesar soon gained a command in Gaul, and there he carved out an empire of his own. For nearly a decade, he fought one of the most astonishing campaigns in Roman history, subduing the tribes of Gaul, crossing into Britain, and even venturing into Germany. His victories brought him immense wealth, glory, and an army fiercely loyal to him. By 50 BCE, Caesar had become a figure both adored by the masses and feared by the Senate, When ordered to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, he chose defiance. In 49 BCE, he crossed the Rubicon River with his legions, declaring the die is cast and ignited civil war. Pompey and the senatorial forces fled to Greece. But Caesar pursued them relentlessly, defeating Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus. Pompey sought refuge in Egypt, but was treacherously murdered, leaving Caesar the undisputed master of Rome. Caesar's rule as dictator was marked by bold reforms. He reorganized the calendar, a system that remains the basis of our own today. He reduced debt, planned colonies for veterans and the poor, and expanded citizenship in the provinces. But his accumulation of power alarmed many senators, who feared that he aimed to be king in all but name. On the Ides of March 44 BCE, Caesar was stabbed to death by a group of conspirators led by Brutus and Cassius. They believed they were saving the Republic, but instead, they plunged it into chaos once more. Civil war returned, this time led by Caesar's allies, Mark Antony, Marcus Lepidus, and Caesar's adopted son, Octavian, who formed the Second Triumvirate. They defeated Brutus and Cassius at Philippi, but soon turned against one another. Lepidus faded into obscurity, while Antony bound himself to Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. Octavian painted Antony as a traitor seduced by the East. And in 31 BCE, their rivalry culminated at the naval battle of Actium. Antony and Cleopatra were defeated, retreating to Egypt where they took their own lives. With Antony gone, Octavian stood supreme. In 27 BCE, he presented himself as a restorer of the Republic, handing powers back to the Senate while quietly keeping ultimate authority for himself. The Senate, in gratitude or fear, bestowed upon him the title Augustus, the revered one. The Republic had ended not with a single decisive blow, but through a century of erosion, bloodshed, and ambition. What rose in its place was a monarchy disguised in republican forms, an empire in all but name. Rome had exchanged the instability of the old republic for the stability of imperial rule, and under Augustus, the Roman Empire was born. When Octavian became Augustus in 27 BCE, Rome entered a new age. After a century of chaos, civil wars, and political assassinations, the people longed for stability. Augustus understood this perfectly. He presented himself not as a king for Romans' despised monarchy, but as the princeps, the first citizen. In reality, however, all power rested in his hands. The Senate remained, elections were held, and old Republican offices still existed, but they were hollow shells of their former selves. Augustus carefully crafted an image of humility, insisting that he was restoring the Republic, while quietly ensuring that nothing important happened without his approval. The Roman world had exchanged freedom for peace, and under Augustus, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace began. Augustus's reign was long and transformative. He reorganized the provinces, creating a system that would last centuries. He placed loyal governors in the provinces and ensured that the army's allegiance belonged directly to him, not to ambitious generals as in the days of the Republic. He reduced the number of legions, keeping them stationed along the empire's frontiers, and created the Praetorian Guard, an elite unit stationed near Rome to serve as his personal protectors. In matters of finance, he established a fairer system of taxation, reducing corruption, and filling Rome's treasury with revenue from the provinces. He understood the importance of public image. Temples were rebuilt, monuments were erected, and Augustus himself was portrayed not as a tyrant, but as a father of the nation. The poet Virgil wrote the Aeneid under his patronage, linking Rome's origins to the heroic tales of Troy and destiny itself. In art, architecture, literature, and politics, Augustus reshaped Rome into an empire that seemed ordained by the gods. Yet Augustus was not without challenges. Rebellions erupted in provinces such as Spain and the Balkans. And in 09 CE, disaster struck when 3 Roman legions were ambushed and annihilated in the Teutoburg forest by Germanic tribes led by Arminius. The loss was catastrophic, and Augustus reportedly wandered his palace crying, "Quinctilis veris, give me back my legions." From then on, the Rhine became the effective boundary of Roman expansion into Germania. Despite this, Augustus managed to maintain control and prosperity throughout his rule. When he died in 14 CE, at the age of 75, he had ruled for over 40 years and left behind an empire far stronger than the fractured republic he had inherited. His stepson Tiberius succeeded him, and with this succession, the Julio-Claudian dynasty was born. Tiberius, though a capable general and administrator, was a reluctant emperor, reserved, suspicious, and often grim. He lacked the charisma of Augustus. At first, he governed wisely, maintaining Augustus's systems. But over time, he grew increasingly paranoid. Political trials and treason charges became common, and senators lived in fear of falling from his favor. Eventually, Tiberius withdrew almost entirely from Rome, retreating to the island of Capri, where lurid rumors of debauchery and cruelty tarnished his reputation. In his absence, real power often fell into the hands of the Praetorian Guard and ambitious advisors. By the time of his death in 37 CE, many in Rome welcomed his passing with relief. The throne then passed to Gaius, better known by his childhood nickname, Caligula, meaning little boots, a reference to the miniature soldier's outfit he wore as a boy while accompanying his father's army. At first, his reign was greeted with joy. The people believed that at last, a youthful, popular ruler would restore Rome's glory. But Caligula's rule quickly descended into infamy. Ancient historians paint him as cruel, erratic, and obsessed with extravagance. He exhausted the treasury on lavish spectacles, ordered grandiose building projects, and indulged in bizarre whims. Stories, some exaggerated, others possibly true, tell of him declaring himself a living god, demanding worship, and even appointing his favorite horse as a priest, with rumors that he intended to make it a consul. His reign of terror alienated both senators and soldiers alike. In 41 CE, after less than 4 years, Caligula was assassinated in a conspiracy led by members of the Praetorian Guard. Following Caligula's murder, chaos might have returned to Rome, but fortune placed an unlikely man upon the throne. Claudius, the uncle of Caligula, had long been dismissed as weak and unsuitable, mocked for his limp and speech impediment. Yet once crowned, Claudius proved surprisingly effective. He was intelligent, hardworking, and keenly aware of Rome's needs. Under Claudius, the empire expanded further, most famously with the conquest of Britain in 43 CE, a campaign that finally brought the island into Rome's orbit. He reformed the administration, relying heavily on freedmen and secretaries rather than senators, which earned him resentment from the aristocracy, but ensured efficiency in governance. Claudius was also a great builder, leaving behind aqueducts, roads, and new ports that strengthened Rome's infrastructure. However, his private life was tumultuous, marked by court intrigues and fatal marriages. His final wife, Agrippina, the younger, secured the succession for her son Nero, allegedly. By poisoning Claudius in 54 CE, the rise of Nero began with promise. As a teenager under the guidance of wise advisors such as Seneca, the philosopher, and Burrus, the Praetorian prefect, his rule appeared moderate and enlightened. He was praised for lowering taxes, promoting the arts, and showing generosity to the people. Yet as he grew older, darker aspects of his character came to dominate. Nero fancied himself an artist, singer, and actor, scandalizing Roman society by performing on stage, something no emperor had ever done. Meanwhile, he grew increasingly ruthless, ordering the murder of his own mother, Agrippina, and eliminating rivals with cold efficiency. In 64 CE, a great fire ravaged Rome, destroying vast districts of the city. Rumors spread that Nero himself had ordered the fire, either to clear space for his grand architectural projects or simply out of madness. Whether true or not, the suspicion clung to him, and in order to deflect blame, he accused Christians, a small but growing sect, of starting the blaze. What followed was one of the earliest and most brutal persecutions of Christians in Roman history, with many burned alive or thrown to wild beasts. Nero's extravagance bankrupted the empire, and his erratic behavior alienated the Senate, the army, and even the people of Rome. Rebellions broke out in the provinces, and generals began to declare loyalty to themselves rather than to the emperor. In 68 CE, facing certain defeat, Nero fled the city. Abandoned by his guards and condemned as a public enemy by the Senate, he took his own life, allegedly declaring, "What an artist dies in me." His death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the first imperial family of Rome, and it left the empire once again on the brink of chaos. The story of the Julio-Claudians is one of contrasts. From Augustus's careful statecraft and Claudius' unexpected competence to the paranoia of Tiberius, the madness of Caligula, and the cruelty of Nero. In less than a century, Rome had seen both the promise of empire and the perils of absolute power. With Nero gone, the throne was vacant. And the year that followed would plunge Rome into civil war and uncertainty as rival generals vied for the purple. The empire had been built, but whether it could endure remained an open question. When Nero took his own life in June of 68 CE, the Julio-Claudian dynasty that had ruled Rome for nearly a century came to a dramatic and bloody end. For the first time since Augustus, there was no clear heir, no carefully arranged succession, and no figure powerful enough to claim legitimacy through blood. The empire, vast and restless, was suddenly without a master. The Senate, the Praetorian Guard, and the legions stationed on the frontiers all realized that the throne was open to anyone who could seize it. What followed was one of the most turbulent years in Roman history, a year that would see 4 men crowned emperor, one after the other, in a whirlwind of betrayal, rebellion, and civil war. The first to claim the throne was Servius Sulpicius Galba, governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, a stern old general known for his strict discipline. With Nero dead, Galba marched his forces into Italy, and the Senate, desperate for order, recognized him as emperor. At first, his rule seemed to promise stability, but Galba quickly revealed himself to be harsh, inflexible, and unpopular. He refused to pay the promised donatives to the Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty was essential, and he alienated the legions who had brought him to power. His reign, lasting only a few months, was marked by executions, confiscations, and cruelty. By early 69 CE, conspiracies were already forming against him. In January of that year, the Praetorian Guard turned on him, murdering him in the Roman Forum and parading his severed head through the streets. In Galba's place, the Praetorians elevated Marcus Salvius Otho, a former ally of Nero, and one of Galba's early supporters who had turned against him. Otho was younger, charismatic, and more popular with the soldiers, but his reign was immediately challenged. In the provinces, the legions of the Rhine had already declared their own commander, Aulus Vitellius, as emperor. 2 emperors now claimed the throne, and civil war erupted once again. Otho led his forces north to confront Vitellius's legions, but in April of 69 CE, he was defeated at the Battle of Bedriacum in northern Italy. Rather than prolong the bloodshed, Otho took his own life, winning him the rare respect of later historians, who saw him as a man who chose death over dragging Rome deeper into war. Vitellius, a portly and indulgent man, now entered Rome as emperor. His rule, however, was marked by extravagance, gluttony, and cruelty. He bankrupted the treasury with lavish feasts and spectacles, executed political opponents, and squandered the goodwill of both Senate and soldiers. But his greatest challenge came not from within Rome, but from the east. In Judea, the legions there had proclaimed their commander, Titus Flavius Vespasianus, better known simply as Vespasian, as emperor. Vespasian was a seasoned general, known for his pragmatic leadership, his humility, his ability to connect with ordinary soldiers. Unlike Vitellius, who wasted Rome's resources, Vespasian represented discipline and order. His forces, led by generals loyal to him, marched on Italy, defeating Vitellius's supporters in a brutal campaign. In December of 69 CE, Vespasian's troops stormed Rome, and Vitellius was dragged from hiding and killed. His body was thrown into the Tiber, and with his death, the chaos of the year of the 4 emperors finally came to an end. Vespasian emerged as the victor and established the Flavian dynasty, which would rule Rome for the next 27 years. His reign began in 69 CE and marked a decisive turning point for the empire. Vespasian was a man of humble origins, the first emperor not descended from the ancient aristocracy, but from the equestrian class, the Roman middle order. He rose through the military ranks by merit, not by noble birth, and his pragmatism shaped his rule. Rome had been drained by years of excess under Nero and the civil wars that followed, and Vespasian's first priority was to restore financial stability. He introduced new taxes, tightened state finances, and made sure that money flowed back into Rome's coffers, though sometimes mocked for his frugality. He even taxed public toilets, earning the famous saying, "Money does not stink." These measures brought stability to a state that had been teetering on the edge of collapse. Vespasian also began one of the most iconic building projects in Roman history: the construction of the Flavian Amphitheater, known today as the Colosseum. Built on the site of Nero's former palace gardens, the Colosseum was not just a marvel of engineering, but also a powerful political symbol. Where Nero had built a golden house for himself, Vespasian gave the people of Rome a vast arena for games, spectacles, and gladiatorial contests. It was a deliberate gesture, reminding the city that this emperor ruled for the people, not for personal vanity. In the provinces, Vespasian's authority was equally strong. He and his son Titus continued the war in Judea, which had begun under Nero. After years of bitter fighting, Titus captured Jerusalem in 70 CE, destroying the Great Temple, an event that would resonate for millennia in Jewish history. The spoils of the war enriched Rome, funding not only the Colosseum, but also other great projects that restored the city's grandeur. Vespasian, though not as glamorous as some of his predecessors, won lasting respect as a stabilizer, a restorer, and a ruler who placed duty above luxury. He reigned for a decade before dying of natural causes in 79 CE, leaving the throne to his elder son Titus. Titus, already celebrated for his victory in Jerusalem, inherited his father's popularity. His reign, though brief, was remembered with great affection. He presided over the completion of the Colosseum, inaugurating it with 100 days of games, where thousands of animals and gladiators entertained the crowds in spectacles of blood and grandeur. But Titus's reign was overshadowed by disaster. In August of 79 CE, only a few months after he became emperor, Mount Vesuvius erupted in one of the most violent volcanic explosions in history. The cities of Pompeii, Herculaneum, and others were buried under ash and pumice, killing tens of thousands. The catastrophe shocked the empire, yet Titus responded with compassion, providing aid and relief for the victims. 2 years later, Rome itself was struck by a great fire and a devastating plague. Once again, Titus poured resources into relief efforts, earning him the enduring love of the people. When he died suddenly in 81 CE, after only 2 years on the throne, Romans mourned deeply. His younger brother Domitian succeeded him. Domitian's reign, lasting from 81 to 96 CE, was long and marked by contradiction. At first, he governed efficiently, strengthening the economy, defending the frontiers, and overseeing an ambitious building program that left Rome adorned with temples and monuments. He centralized authority firmly in his hands, demanding to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, a title that shocked the senatorial class but reflected the growing reality of imperial autocracy. Over time, his rule grew harsher. He distrusted the Senate, relied heavily on informants, and unleashed treason trials that spread fear through the aristocracy. His paranoia deepened, and executions of supposed conspirators became common. Though he maintained order in the empire and was popular with the army, his autocratic style earned him powerful enemies in Rome. In 96 CE, Domitian was assassinated in a palace conspiracy involving court officials and possibly his own wife. His death ended the Flavian dynasty. But it also ushered in a new era, the reign of the so-called Five Good Emperors, a century of relative peace, prosperity, and stability. Yet the memory of the Flavians endured. Vespasian had restored Rome after civil war, Titus had been beloved despite calamities, and Domitian, though feared, had reinforced the power of the imperial throne. Together, they transformed Rome after the chaos of the Julio-Claudians and the year of the Four Emperors, setting the stage for the empire's golden age. When Domitian was assassinated in 96 CE, the Roman Empire stood at a crossroads. The Flavian dynasty had restored order after civil war, but Domitian's paranoia and tyranny had left a bitter aftertaste among the Senate and aristocracy. For the first time in decades, the choice of emperor was not decided by heredity, but by careful selection. The Senate, desperate to avoid another autocrat, turned to an elderly and respected official named Marcus Cocceius Nerva. Nerva had no army of his own, no dynastic claim, and no great personal ambition. But his greatest virtue was that he was acceptable to all sides, to the Senate, to the Praetorian Guard, and to the provinces. Thus began an extraordinary century in which Rome would be ruled not by inheritance or accident, but by deliberate succession. each emperor choosing the most capable successor rather than passing the throne to an unworthy son. Later generations would call this the Age of the Five Good Emperors, a golden century of peace, stability, and prosperity. Nerva's reign was short, lasting from 96 to 98 CE, but it was significant. He reversed many of Domitian's harsher policies, released political prisoners, stored confiscated property, and reaffirmed the Senate's dignity. His greatest act, however, was to adopt a successor. Marcus Ulpius Traianus, known to history as Trajan, a respected general from Hispania. By naming Trajan heir, Nerva set a precedent. The empire would not pass automatically by blood, but by choice, ensuring competent leadership. When Nerva died in 98 CE, the transition was smooth, and Rome gained one of its most extraordinary rulers. Trajan was a soldier emperor, beloved by his troops and admired by the people. Under his reign, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent. He launched a series of campaigns against the Dacians, fierce tribes who inhabited the lands north of the Danube, in present-day Romania. The Dacian king, Decebalus, had long been a thorn in Rome's side, raiding the provinces and defying Roman authority. Trajan, determined to end the threat once and for all, led to great campaigns between 101 and 106 CE. After bitter fighting and the construction of a massive bridge across the Danube by the engineer Apollodorus of Damascus, Trajan finally crushed the Dacians. Decebalus took his own life, and Dacia became a Roman province. The conquest was celebrated with the erection of Trajan's Column, a towering monument in Rome that still stands today, its spiraling reliefs telling the story of the campaign in vivid detail. The spoils of war filled Rome's treasury, allowing Trajan to embark on grand building projects, markets, forums, roads, and aqueducts that transformed the capital into the greatest city of the ancient world. But Trajan's ambitions did not stop there. In the east, he turned his gaze toward the wealthy Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival. Between 113 and 117 CE, he launched a bold campaign into Mesopotamia, capturing Armenia, seizing the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon, and extending Rome's borders to the Persian Gulf. It was the high-water mark of Roman expansion, yet the conquest proved difficult to maintain. The eastern provinces were restless, supply lines stretched thin, and revolts erupted in conquered territories. When Trajan fell ill in 117 CE and died on his way back to Rome, much of his eastern conquest was abandoned by his successor. Still, his legacy endured. Trajan was remembered not only as a conqueror, but as a just ruler, praised for his fairness, generosity, and humility. Later emperors would be honored with the phrase, "May you be luckier than Augustus and better than Trajan." Trajan's successor was his cousin's adopted son, Publius alias Hadrianus. Hadrian. Trajan had been a conqueror, Hadrian was a consolidator. He understood that Rome's vast empire was already difficult to govern, and further expansion would only bring instability. Instead, Hadrian focused on strengthening and defining Rome's borders. In the north, he traveled to Britannia, where he ordered the construction of Hadrian's Wall, a massive fortification stretching across the width of the island, separating Roman-controlled territory from the unconquered lands of the Caledonians. It was not just a wall, but a symbol of Roman order standing against barbarian chaos. Across the empire, Hadrian inspected frontiers, reorganized defenses, and established a system of permanent fortifications and roads. Hadrian was also a lover of Greek culture. He admired philosophy, architecture, and the arts, earning him the nickname Graeculus, Little Greek. He adorned Athens with magnificent buildings, including the Grand Temple of Olympian Zeus, and sought to blend Roman power with Hellenic culture. His reign, however, was not without bloodshed. In Judea, the Jewish population rose in a massive revolt known as the Bar Kokhba Revolt, 132 to 136 CE. Sparked by Hadrian's decision to build a Roman colony, Aelia Capitolina, on the ruins of Jerusalem and to restrict Jewish religious practices, the revolt was ferocious, lasting 3 years, and the Romans responded with brutal force. Entire towns were destroyed, and countless lives were lost. In the end, Judea was devastated, and the survivors were scattered, an event that shaped Jewish history profoundly. Remembered as both a philosopher king and a stern defender of the empire's unity. Before his death, Hadrian adopted Antoninus Pius, on the condition that Antoninus in turn adopt Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus as his heirs. Antoninus Pius, who reigned from 138 to 161 CE, lived up to his name, Pius, for his devotion to duty, law, and religion. His reign was perhaps the most peaceful of all Roman emperors. Unlike Trajan or Hadrian, Antoninus waged no major wars, choosing instead to defend and maintain Rome's borders through diplomacy and careful governance. He was a skilled administrator, reforming laws, improving infrastructure, and providing aid in times of disaster. Under his rule, the empire prospered, trade flourished, and the people enjoyed stability. His frugality and fairness earned him universal respect. Antoninus's long reign was seen as a golden age of calm, a reminder that Rome could thrive not only under warriors, but under wise and steady rulers. When Antoninus died in 161 CE, the succession passed smoothly to his adopted sons, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, who ruled jointly. Lucius Verus, though less distinguished, commanded Rome's armies in the east against the Parthians, while Marcus Aurelius, remembered by history as the philosopher emperor, became one of the most remarkable rulers of all. Marcus was deeply influenced by Stoic philosophy, believing in duty, reason, and self-control. His private reflections, later collected in the Meditations, remain one of the most profound works of philosophy from antiquity. Yet Marcus's reign was far from peaceful. The Parthian War drained Rome's resources, and returning soldiers carried with them a devastating plague, likely smallpox, that swept across the empire, killing millions. The empire's population shrank, the economy suffered, and fear spread through cities and countryside alike. To the north, Germanic tribes began pressing against the Danube frontier. For much of his reign, Marcus was forced to spend years on campaign, personally leading his troops in the Marcomannic Wars. These were bitter, grueling conflicts that tested the empire's strength. Even in the face of war and plague, Marcus Aurelius remained a symbol of calm and duty. He saw his role not as a privilege, but as a burden of responsibility, to be carried with reason and humility. But in one crucial decision, Marcus broke with the tradition of adoption. Rather than selecting a capable outsider, he allowed his biological son, Commodus, to inherit the throne. In 180 CE, when Marcus died on campaign, the golden age of the 5 good emperors came to an end, and Rome's fortunes began to change. This century, from Nerva to Marcus Aurelius, is remembered as the high point of the Roman Empire. The frontiers were secure, the provinces prosperous, and the emperors themselves capable and wise. Rome had reached a balance of power, culture, and stability rarely seen in history. Yet this golden age was fragile, dependent on the rare coincidence of good rulers chosen by adoption rather than heredity. With Commodus' succession, that delicate balance collapsed, and Rome would soon face turbulence once again. The Roman Empire, which had once stood tall and unshakable under the wise stewardship of emperors like Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius, began to show its cracks in the late 2nd century. The empire was vast, stretching from the wild moors of Britain to the sands of Arabia, from the Atlantic Ocean to the great rivers of Mesopotamia. It had wealth, armies, and the awe of the ancient world. But beneath this surface of grandeur, pressures were building. Barbarian tribes pressed on the borders. Plague had thinned the population. The treasury was strained, and unity depended above all on the skill of the emperor. And when Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, leaving the throne to his son Commodus, the age of steady, leadership gave way to a century of turmoil, civil war, and near collapse. A period historians would later call the crisis of the 3rd century. Commodus, the son of a philosopher, proved to be his father's opposite in every way. Where Marcus Aurelius had been austere, reflective, and devoted to duty, Commodus was indulgent, flamboyant, and dangerously self-absorbed. He delighted not in governance, but in spectacle. He fancied himself the living embodiment of Hercules, commissioning statues of himself draped in lion skins, wielding a club and demanding worship. He took to the arena, fighting as a gladiator before cheering crowds, a shocking act for never before had a Roman emperor so openly mingled with entertainers and slaves. To the common people, Commodus's antics were amusing, even thrilling. To the Senate and the aristocracy, they were humiliating, a sign that Rome's highest office had fallen into mockery. His reign became marked by paranoia and bloodshed. Anyone suspected of conspiracy, senators, generals, even members of his own household, could be executed at a moment's whim. In 192 CE, Commodus's madness reached its height. He announced that Rome would be renamed Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus, and the months of the year would be renamed in his honor. The great capital of the empire was, in his imagination, to be his personal playground, but his arrogance sealed his fate. On the final day of the year, a conspiracy formed by his mistress, palace officials, and members of the Praetorian Guard succeeded in strangling him to death. His body was dragged ignominiously through the streets, and the Senate, relieved, declared him a public enemy. The dynasty of the Antonines was finished. The death of Commodus opened a vacuum of power that plunged Rome into chaos. The year 193 CE became infamous as the year of the 5 emperors. First came Pertinax, an elderly senator chosen in haste. A man of discipline and integrity, he tried to impose order, cutting back the excesses of Commodus's reign. But his reforms angered the Praetorian Guard, who had grown greedy and corrupt. After only 86 days, they stormed the palace and murdered him. In one of the most disgraceful episodes in Roman history, the Praetorian Guard then auctioned off the imperial throne to the highest bidder. A wealthy senator, Didius Julianus, won the bidding war, promising each soldier a vast sum of money. He became emperor not by birth, conquest, or election, but by purchase. Julianus's reign was short and despised. Across the empire, real soldiers under real generals were appalled. 3 powerful men rose in revolt: Pescennius Niger in Syria, Clodius Albinus in Britain, and Septimius Severus in the Danubian provinces. Severus, a shrewd commander of African origin, acted with speed. Marching on Rome, he was welcomed by the Senate, and Julianus was executed. Severus defeated his rivals one by one, consolidating power, and thus began the Severan dynasty. Septimius Severus was a soldier first and foremost. He lavished money and privileges on the army, knowing it was the true foundation of imperial power. He reformed military pay, allowed soldiers to marry legally, and tied their loyalty directly to himself. This secured his throne, but it also created a dangerous precedent. Emperors henceforth would be beholden to the soldiers above all else. Severus waged successful campaigns against the Parthians and expanded Roman control in Africa and Britain, where he personally led campaigns into Scotland. But when he died in 211 CE at York, he left the empire to his 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta, who despised one another. The joint rule collapsed almost immediately. Within a year, Caracalla arranged his brother's assassination, murdering Geta in their mother's arms, and ruled alone. Caracalla was ruthless, but he made one decision of lasting significance. In 212 CE, he issued the Constitutio Antoniana, granting Roman citizenship to nearly every free inhabitant of the empire. This transformed the Roman world, erasing the legal divide between Romans and provincials. But it was motivated less by idealism than by practical need. It expanded the tax base to fund his army. Caracalla spent much of his reign campaigning, particularly in the east. But in 217 CE, he was assassinated by one of his own soldiers while on campaign. What followed was a dizzying parade of emperors, each rising by the sword and falling by it. Elagabalus, a teenage priest devoted to an exotic Syrian sun god, shocked Rome with his eccentric religious practices and disregard for tradition. He dressed as a woman, married a Vestal virgin, and attempted to make his god supreme in the Roman pantheon. His bizarre behavior outraged soldiers and citizens alike, and after 4 years, he was murdered by the Praetorian Guard. He was succeeded by his cousin Severus Alexander, a more sober and well-meaning youth. But Alexander was weak, dominated by his mother, and indecisive in military matters. When he tried to negotiate with invading Germanic tribes, his soldiers saw it as cowardice. In 235 CE, they turned on him and killed him, along with his mother. With his death, the Severan dynasty collapsed, and the empire entered its deepest crisis. The half-century that followed, from 235 to 284 CE, is one of the most chaotic in Roman history. It is often called the military anarchy, or simply the crisis of the 3rd century. In this time, the empire saw more than 20 emperors, most reigning only a year or two before being assassinated or overthrown. Few died peacefully. The Senate was powerless, reduced to a spectator. True power lay in the hands of the legions, who proclaimed emperors at will. Whenever a general gained the loyalty of his troops, he could march on Rome and seize power. Civil wars became constant, with armies of Romans slaughtering one another while external enemies pressed at the borders. The challenges Rome faced were immense. To the north, Germanic tribes such as the Alemanni, Goths, and Franks poured across the Rhine and Danube, raiding deep into Roman lands. To the east, the old Parthian Empire had been replaced by the Sassanid Persians, far more aggressive and centralized. Their king, Shapur I, inflicted devastating defeats on Rome. In 260 CE, the Emperor Valerian marched east to confront him, but was captured alive. The first Roman emperor ever to be taken prisoner by a foreign enemy. Humiliated, Valerian spent the rest of his life in captivity, reportedly used as a human footstool by the Persian king before being executed. His fate shocked the Roman world, as if foreign invasions and civil wars were not enough. The empire also faced economic and social collapse. The constant need to pay soldiers drove emperors to debase the currency, flooding the economy with silver coins of ever-decreasing purity. Inflation soared, trade declined, and markets grew unstable. Cities shrank as people fled to the countryside. The population had already been weakened by the Antonine Plague of the previous century, and new outbreaks of disease further reduced manpower for the army and productivity for the fields. The once wealthy Mediterranean world seemed to be unraveling. In this chaos, the empire even began to fragment. In the west, the provinces of Gaul, Hispania, and Britain broke away to form the so-called Gallic Empire under the general Postumus. In the east, the wealthy city of Palmyra, under its remarkable queen Zenobia, carved out an empire of its own, controlling Syria, Egypt, and much of Asia Minor. For a time, it seemed that Rome itself might splinter permanently, reduced from a universal empire to a patchwork of regional states. And yet, Rome endured. A few strong rulers rose up to briefly stabilize the empire. Gallienus, ruling from 253 to 268 CE, though beset by invasions and rebellions, began reforms of the army, separating cavalry into a more mobile strike force that would shape later Roman warfare. Later came Aurelian, ruling from 272 to 75 CE, who earned the title Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world, in a series of brilliant campaigns. He defeated the Gallic Empire in the west and crushed Zenobia's Palmyrene Empire in the east, reuniting the fractured lands under Roman rule. He also built the massive Aurelian walls around the city of Rome itself, recognizing that even the capital was no longer safe from attack. But like so many of his predecessors, Aurelian fell victim to conspiracy, murdered by his own officers. By the 280s, the empire was exhausted. Decades of civil war, invasion, plague, and economic breakdown had left scars everywhere. Cities were smaller, fields lay abandoned, armies were restless, and loyalty was fragile. The old institutions of the Republic and even the early Principate had long since crumbled. Rome could not survive another century under this chaos. What it needed was not just a strong emperor, but a complete reorganization of power. That solution would come with Diocletian, a soldier from humble origins who seized power in 284 CE. With him, the crisis of the 3rd century ended, and a new era of imperial rule began. Harsher, more authoritarian, but more stable. The empire that emerged was no longer the Rome of Augustus or Trajan, was something new, forged in crisis, hardened by near collapse. The crisis of the 3rd century was, in many ways, Rome's great trial. It tested every weakness of the empire, political, military, economic, and cultural. And though Rome staggered and nearly fell, it survived. But it was never the same again. The old world of confident emperors, senatorial prestige, and Mediterranean prosperity was gone. What remained was a more militarized, more centralized, and more fragile empire, one that would face new challenges in the centuries to come. By 284 CE, the Roman Empire had been battered nearly to the breaking point. 50 years of civil war, foreign invasion, plague, and economic collapse had left the empire fractured, demoralized, and vulnerable. Rome itself, once the unrivaled heart of the Mediterranean world, seemed increasingly incapable of controlling its vast territories. Into this chaos rose a man of humble origins, Diocletian, born Diocletian in Dalmatia. Unlike the philosopher and peers of the past, Diocletian was a practical soldier. A man of iron will and extraordinary administrative skill. He would not merely react to the crises of the empire. He would reshape its very structure, creating a system designed to prevent the endless anarchy that had defined the previous century. Diocletian's first priority was stabilization. Upon taking power, he confronted both internal rebellion and external threats. To secure the frontiers, he reorganized the army, stationing legions along the Danube, Rhine, and eastern borders. Recognizing the danger of over-centralization and the difficulty of governing such a vast territory from Rome, he moved the seat of imperial authority eastward to Nicomedia, in modern-day Turkey, closer to the Persian frontier. His leadership style was deliberate and authoritarian. Diocletian ruled as a monarch in the classical sense, demanding obeisance and cultivating an aura of divine authority. He adopted elaborate court rituals, including purple robes, ceremonial titles, and strict protocols, emphasizing that the emperor was no mere mortal, but the earthly representative of Rome's power. To address the problem of succession, which had caused decades of instability, Diocletian introduced the revolutionary system known as the Tetrarchy, or Rule of Four. The empire was divided into two halves, East and West. Each half was ruled by a senior emperor, an Augustus, who would be assisted by a junior comperor, a Caesar. In theory, the Caesars would succeed the Augusti, ensuring a smooth and orderly transfer of power. In 293 CE, Diocletian himself became Augustus of the East. With Maximian as Augustus of the West, two Caesars were appointed, Galerius in the East and Constantius Chlorus in the West. This division was not simply administrative. It was a deliberate attempt to prevent the rapid turnover of emperors by giving each ruler his own sphere of command and army, reducing the incentive for rebellion. The Tetrarchy had profound effects on the empire. Each ruler could respond quickly to threats in his region, without waiting for a distant Rome to act. Civil wars were reduced, at least temporarily, and the borders of the empire were more effectively defended against Germanic tribes, Sarmatians and Persians. Diocletian also enacted sweeping economic reforms. He standardized coinage, attempted to curb inflation through price edicts, and sought to stabilize agriculture and trade. While these measures were only partially successful, it demonstrated the emperor's willingness to intervene directly in the empire's economy in ways no previous ruler had dared. Another hallmark of Diocletian's reign was the persecution of Christians, an event that would leave an indelible mark on history. In a world where imperial authority was closely tied to traditional Roman religion, the refusal of Christians to worship the emperor, or the Roman gods, was seen as both religious and political rebellion. Beginning in 303 CE, Diocletian issued a series of edicts banning Christian worship, confiscating church property, and requiring citizens to perform sacrifices to the Roman gods under penalty of death. These persecutions were brutal, affecting thousands across the empire, but ultimately they failed to suppress Christianity, which would continue to grow and eventually rise to prominence under Constantine. In 305 CE, Diocletian voluntarily abdicated, an extraordinary act in Roman history, where emperors almost never relinquished power voluntarily. Maximian also stepped down. The Caesars, Galerius and Constantius, were elevated to Augusti, and two new Caesars were appointed. For a brief moment, the Tetrarchy appeared to work as intended: orderly succession and divided responsibility. But the system was fragile. Personal ambition and loyalty to individual armies soon undermined it. Conflicts erupted between claimants, civil wars resumed, and the empire once again faced political instability. Amid this turmoil, Constantine emerged as the decisive figure who would unify and transform the empire. Constantine was the son of Constantius Chlorus, the Western Caesar. When Constantius died in 306 CE in Britain, his troops proclaimed Constantine emperor. The Tetrarchs initially resisted this, but Constantine secured his position through a combination of military skill, political alliances, and careful diplomacy. Over the next 2 decades, he fought a series of civil wars against rival claimants, Maxentius, Licinius, and others, gradually consolidating control over both the western and eastern halves of the empire. The pivotal moment came in 312 CE at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, where Constantine reportedly experienced a vision of a cross accompanied by the words in this sign, "Conquer." Whether literal or symbolic, this moment marked the beginning of his conversion to Christianity in a profound shift in Roman history. After defeating Maxentius and entering Rome in triumph, Constantine embraced the Christian faith, though carefully balancing it with traditional Roman symbols to avoid alienating pagan elites. In 313 CE, he issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance to Christians and ending the centuries-long persecution. This was a turning point. Christianity, once a persecuted sect, now had the protection of the emperor and would eventually become the dominant religion of the empire. Constantine also transformed the empire administratively. He reunited the divided halves under his authority, structured the army and provincial governance, and moved the imperial capital from Rome to Byzantium, renaming it Constantinople. A city designed to endure as the new political, military, and economic heart of the empire for over 1,000 years. By controlling the eastern and western halves effectively, Constantine established a model of centralized power that would influence Roman governance for centuries, culturally and symbolically. Constantine's reign marked the shift from the classical pagan world to a Christian Roman Empire. He commissioned monumental churches such as the Old St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, supported Christian bishops, and integrated Christian symbols into coinage and architecture. At the same time, he maintained the trappings of imperial authority inherited from Diocletian: elaborate ceremonies, divine titles, and strict control over the bureaucracy and army. The empire that Constantine ruled was stronger, more centralized, and more ideologically unified. Though it had emerged from centuries of crisis and transformation, by the time of Constantine's death in 337 CE, the Roman Empire had been radically reshaped. It had survived the near collapse of the 3rd century. It's consolidated under the reforms of Diocletian and unified under a single emperor who embraced Christianity. The Tetrarchy had failed as a lasting system, but it laid the groundwork for administrative reform. The empire was no longer the Rome of Trajan or Marcus Aurelius, yet it endured. Stronger in some ways, more hierarchical in others, and forever transformed by the emergence of Christianity as a central force in Roman life. The Tetrarchy and the rise of Constantine represent a bridge between the classical world and the medieval era. Between the pagan Roman Empire and the Christian Roman Empire, it was a time of bold experimentation, visionary leadership, and decisive battles. A period when the empire learned, at great cost, how to survive not through tradition alone, but through adaptation, centralization, and the cultivation of loyalty, both from armies and from the people themselves. The transformations of this era would echo through history for centuries, shaping not only the fate of Rome but the course of Europe and the Mediterranean world forever. The death of Constantine in 337 CE marked the end of a unifying force in the Roman world. Though he had brought unprecedented stability, reorganized the empire, and embraced Christianity, his successors struggled to maintain control over the vast territories he had secured. From this moment onward, the Western Roman Empire faced relentless pressure from internal decay and external invasions. The empire that had once stretched from Britain to the Euphrates was beginning a slow but inexorable decline, a process that would culminate in the deposition of the last Western emperor in 476 CE after Constantine. The empire was divided among his sons, a return to the earlier problem of partitioned authority. Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans inherited different regions, but disputes quickly arose. Fratricidal conflict weakened central authority, creating openings for ambitious generals and invading tribes. In the western provinces, the empire faced mounting threats from the Germanic tribes, the Visigoths, Vandals, Suebi, and Franks, who pressed relentlessly on the Rhine and Danube frontiers. In the east, the Sassanid Persians remained a formidable opponent, ensuring that Rome had enemies on all sides. One of the earliest shocks came in 376 CE, when the Visigoths, fleeing the Huns, sought refuge within the empire. Takenly mistreated and exploited by Roman officials, the Visigoths rebelled, culminating in the catastrophic Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, where Emperor Valens was killed, along with a large part of the Eastern Army. This battle exposed the vulnerability of Roman forces to coordinated barbarian attacks and marked the beginning of the empire's permanent military decline. The empire could no longer guarantee the security of its provinces without relying on mercenary troops, many of whom were former enemies. During the 4th and 5th centuries, the empire faced constant internal instability. The succession of emperors was erratic. Many were placed on the throne by military force rather than inheritance or Senate approval. Political power increasingly depended on loyalty from the army, which itself was fractured between Roman-born soldiers and Germanic mercenaries. This militarization of politics weakened civil institutions and allowed ambitious generals to dominate the government. At the same time, the once effective Roman taxation system was crumbling, leaving provinces underfunded and unable to maintain infrastructure, fortifications, and urban centers. Economic decay exacerbated these problems. Trade routes across the Mediterranean became less secure, cities shrank, and rural estates were increasingly self-sufficient, cutting Rome off from centralized control. Inflation and currency debasement weakened the economy, and the population was reduced by repeated plagues and continuous warfare. The empire's social fabric frayed. Loyalty to Rome diminished, and local leaders often acted independently, prioritizing the defense and governance of their regions over imperial authority. One of the most striking aspects of this period was the transformation of Rome's relationship with barbarian peoples. Initially, the empire attempted to integrate these groups as foederati, allied tribes who provided soldiers in exchange for land. While this arrangement temporarily strengthened the military, it also created semi-autonomous enclaves within the empire, eroding central authority. The Visigoths, Vandals, and later the Ostrogoths would become powerful enough to carve out kingdoms within Roman territories, undermining the empire from within. The sack of Rome in 410 CE by Alaric and the Visigoths was a shocking moment for the ancient world. Rome, the eternal city, had not fallen to a foreign enemy in over 800 years. The sack, though relatively restrained compared to later invasions, symbolized the empire's vulnerability and shattered the illusion of invincibility. It also sent ripples of fear and despair across the Mediterranean, signaling to both contemporaries and historians that Rome's decline was accelerating. In the west, the situation worsened as the Vandals crossed into North Africa in 429 CE, seizing the grain-rich provinces of Carthage. The loss of Africa deprived Rome of essential resources, particularly food supply for the city and the armies. The empire became increasingly dependent on mercenary troops, many of whom had divided loyalties or personal agendas. The Western Roman state was no longer capable of projecting power over its vast territory. It could survive only in fragments, under local strongmen and military commanders. Throughout the 5th century, successive emperors struggled to maintain authority. Figures like Honorius, Valentinian III, and Majorian attempted to restore order, often with brief successes. Yet they faced constant challenges from ambitious generals, court intrigues, and relentless barbarian incursions. Rome itself was sacked a second time, in 455 CE, by the Vandals under Genseric, leaving the city further weakened, traumatized, and depopulated. By now, the Western Empire had become a shadow of its former glory, with the Eastern Empire centered in Constantinople, carrying the burden of imperial continuity. The final collapse came gradually. In 476 CE, Romulus Augustulus, a young and largely powerless emperor, was deposed by Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain and leader of the foederati forces in Italy. Odoacer declared himself ruler of Italy, sending the imperial regalia to Constantinople, symbolically ending the Western Roman Empire. Though the Eastern Empire continued for another 1,000 years, the fall of the West marked the end of classical Rome's authority over its western provinces and the beginning of a fragmented medieval Europe. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not a sudden event, but the result of decades of accumulated pressures: political instability, military overreach, economic decline, social fragmentation, and relentless external attacks. It was a period marked by heroism and tragedy, innovation and collapse. a time when Rome's centuries of glory gave way to uncertainty and transformation. Yet even in its decline, the Roman legacy endured. Law, architecture, language, and culture would continue to shape Europe and the Mediterranean for centuries, a testament to the empire that had once ruled the world. The story of the fall of the Western Roman Empire is a story of human ambition, resilience, and vulnerability. It teaches that even the mightiest civilizations are not immortal, but that their influence can outlast their political existence. Echoing through the centuries in ways both visible and profound,